Dr. Sy Garte, thank you for joining us on the Men for God podcast. Good to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So, for all those on this side of the Atlantic who don't know your story, could you tell us a little part of it?
Sure. I came to Christianity very late in life. I was raised in a very left-wing, in fact, communist, atheist household. My parents had been members of the American Communist Party in the 1930s, and atheism was part of that. But it was a very strong atheism. It wasn't just, well, we don't know if there's a God, or I used to think there was a God, now I don't. No, not at all. I mean, my family going back 3 generations were firm atheists, including all my grandparents. So that's how I grew up. And my father was a scientist, chemist, and I gravitated in that direction. And when I got to college, I majored in chemistry, and then in graduate school, I majored in biochemistry, became a PhD in biochemistry. Eventually got faculty positions where I did research, and I was an active scientist for the next 30, 35 years in academia. I spent the last few years of my career at the NIH, but more in an administrative position. So very much a scientist. I published over 200 papers and, did a lot of research in several fields, including genetics and related areas. All that time, I was still an atheist, but I had a slow change in intellectual ideology because I realized from science, from some of the things I'd learned in physics, just simple things like quantum mechanics. Well, I shouldn't say simple, but basic things like the basis of quantum mechanics and some of the other new physics didn't quite jive with my worldview, which was extremely materialist, reductionist, naturalist. In other words, the general idea was that any question you had about anything could be answered by science and only science. That's now called scientism, but it was a fairly popular view among my circle. But in fact, it turns out that actual scientists don't hold to that. Even my father, who was an absolute total atheist, said that science cannot explain everything. There are things in the world that are beyond science. And we all know that, although some people try not to. But, things like love and art and things that are way outside of the scientific domain really don't have any correlates. Although some people try, as I said, some people try to twist evolution and bend it to the way that so it could explain everything, including morality and love and everything else. So I started questioning this, and I started, trying to understand what else was, if there was something missing. And I decided there was something missing, but I didn't know what it was. And I kind of became an agnostic at some point in my life. I would say it was roughly in my 40s. I'd already been a scientist for some time, still struggling with the career. Building a science career is an all-encompassing pursuit. You don't have any time off. And so I didn't have a lot of time to think about this. But when I did, I was curious. And then I don't think I would have gone any further, frankly. I think I would today still be an agnostic, wondering, what else is there, but just flat out rejecting anything supernatural. If it had not been for the work of the Holy Spirit, I claim no credit for having come to faith on my own. I did not. I had dreams. I had 3 or 4 dreams, 2 of which I've talked about frequently, and they're in my first book, which I should mention is The Works of His Hands, A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. And that came out in 2019. It talks about science, and it talks about my journey. There's one chapter that's all about my own personal journey. And that includes these 2 dreams, which were very powerful. And the first one I had when I was still a full-blown atheist, and I couldn't understand it at all. but I didn't forget it. And the second one, I was already wondering about things. The other thing that happened was a friend of mine brought me to a church at some point. I was already at this point thinking, well, maybe God is not impossible. Maybe it's possible. And the church experience was eye-opening to me because, and this always sounds funny when I say it, but I really expected, I was terrified walking. I'd never walked into any house of worship in my life. I was 45, and I was terrified. I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought people would throw stones at me, or at worst, or perhaps just point at me and say, "Look at that, infidel, that heathen, whatever." Uh,
Fire and brimstone.
yeah, fire and brimstone would come down from the ceiling and hit me on the head. And
Yeah.
I just was. It didn't happen that way. I was completely the opposite. Everybody was very nice. They didn't ask me any questions. They shook my hand. They wished me peace, which was nice. This is a Catholic church, so the priest gave a sermon about love. He didn't yell at people and tell them they were going to hell. He just talked about love. And I was thinking, I think I've been lied to. This Christianity isn't that bad. Because, you see, I forgot to mention this when I talked about my upbringing. It wasn't just that there was no God. I was taught that religion was evil, all religion. And probably Christianity the worst, because that's the one that, that my family knew about. Everything bad in the world was either directly or indirectly a result of religion. So I didn't see that when I went to the church. I thought maybe they're hiding it very well, but that wasn't the impression I got. And so then I had the second dream, which was very powerful, and was really about Christ. And I started thinking about it. I actually started reading the Forbidden Book, the book that is everybody in the world has read except me at that point. And then I didn't like what I read in the Old Testament. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it meant talking about. But I went over to the book of Matthew, and that was an eye opener. And then I read, which is still my favorite book in the Bible, I read the book of Acts, and that blew me away. I mean, and the reason it blew me away was, and of course this is not the first person who's ever said this, but Luke is clearly writing history. He's not making this up. I mean, my favorite subject in school was always history, more than science. I love history. I love reading history for fun. And this was written like a historical document. It wasn't made up. I mean, I've been told that everything in the Bible is a myth. Jesus was not real. The apostles never existed. The religion came from who knows where, but none of this was real. No. If you read Luke and the book of Acts together, and of course also Matthew and all of Paul's letters, this wasn't made up. This really happened. Or at least somebody thought it really happened. So that was making me, I actually started going to church a little more regularly, like every couple of months I'd show up. And I had feelings. I had feelings and emotional feelings, I guess, again, coming from the Spirit that just told me this is real. And then, of course, I'd go home and I'd say, no. It can't be real. And finally, after struggling like this for several years, 2 or 3 years, I was driving long distance from New York to Pittsburgh, and I had a religious experience in the car. It was partially a vision. I was awake, and it was so powerful that when it was over, I burst into tears and I said, I believe. And I've been a Christian ever since. And there's no possibility that I would ever give it up. People have asked me that. I've done some interviews with atheists, and they said, well, what would make you change your mind and go back to the truth? And I'd say, no, I am at the truth, and nothing would change my mind, because once I said those words, I believe,
Mm.
The universe changed for me. And I've heard this from other people as well later. I had such a rush of joy, relief, freedom. It was amazing. I mean, it's impossible to explain. I was sitting in my car all alone. I had turned off the radio. I was pulled over to the side of the road, luckily. And I was just weeping with joy, and then, of course, the hard part began because I didn't know any other Christians. I was still working as a scientist. I was at the University of Pittsburgh. And then, I didn't know any other Christians in the sciences. Later, of course, I found out they're all over the place, and I have hundreds of friends who are Christians and scientists. But I didn't know any then. And a little bit later, Francis Collins came out with his book, The Language of God, and I read it, and I said, "Well, there's two of us. Okay, that's good." And that's kind of that's the short version. Not that short, but that's the short version.
Oh, Sy, that is great. Do you mind if I ask you some questions just
No,
around
please
the
do.
elements?
Please do.
So, obviously, growing up, faith is the opium of the masses.
Yeah.
But you talked about something within your kind of journey where, as you obviously in your academic career, you look deeply into science, and you seen things that poked holes in your kind of materialist view.
Yeah.
What were those things that not necessarily drove you to the Christian faith, but drove you to this agnosticism? What were those things?
Yeah, the Christian faith came later, but the first thing, the way I usually put it is, I felt like I was, in a chamber of atheism, and there was a door. I could also call it a prison. There was a door which I couldn't open, and there were bars and all that. And what was happening was things were kind of shaking the foundation of that prison. I mean, the bricks were kind of getting loose in the wall. And what was doing that? Well, the uncertainty principle in physics was one. And the uncertainty principle is a absolutely true, indisputable, nobody contests it. It was discovered by Werner Heisenberg. And what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle says is, electrons are kind of strange. You can never know at the same time where they are and how fast they're going. You can know one of them, but the more you know about the position of an electron, the less you know about its direction, its speed. The more you know about its speed, its momentum, actually, the less you know about its position. And that's not because we need more data or we need more laws. No, that's a fundamental, rock solid principle of modern physics. And that means we can't know everything. Right there. That by itself says, no, you will never be able to know those two things at the same time. Now, that's not the only thing that's weird about electrons. Quantum theory includes the fact that electrons, and this is also true for photons, which are particles of light, and other very tiny subatomic particles, are two things at once. They're particles, they're actual pieces of stuff, but they're also waves. And those are not the same. That's like saying, what's the analogy I use? Oh, yeah. It's like saying this baseball bat is made entirely of aluminum. It's also made entirely of wood. And they're both true. And in my second book, which is called Science and Faith in Harmony, I use that as an example for why it is not illogical or unscientific to say that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully human.
Wow.
Because an electron is fully a particle and fully a wave. Now, I didn't know the Jesus analogists at the time, but when I first heard about this, and people want to look up this, they can look at the split screen experiment, which prove this fact. This is not in dispute. Also, this is none of this is woo. This is all real science.
Mm.
And if you look up the split screen experiment, you'll see that if you shoot a beam of electrons at slits, sometimes they'll act as particles, sometimes they'll act as waves, or both. And that just, again, makes no sense. And there are 3 or 4 other things about quantum physics that literally make no sense, although they are absolutely true. Quantum theory has been proven beyond any possibility of refutation. So, that kind of made me think, how is this true? And what a lot of people have come to, I mean, some physicists just say, well, we don't care about that. That's philosophy. It works. So that's all we want to know. The meaning, the logic, what it implies, that's for other people. We're not going to think about it.
They're in that prison in a sense of materialism. They don't want to touch the why.
Yeah. Although I will say that I think some surveys have shown that physicists tend to be slightly more religious than biologists, for example. And I'm a biologist. And of course, the key thing in biology is evolution, right? Which explains everything. Turns out, no, it doesn't. And to get into that's a whole nother topic, which is much more recent. That wasn't part of my conversion. But there are things that evolution cannot and does not explain. And I have a 3rd book, which will be coming out in the spring. That was, the first earthquakes that kind of shook the foundation a little loose. But I was a long way from coming to faith at that point. What it did lead me to was exploration of non-scientific ways of looking at the world. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 47. So, the 60s was my time of young adulthood, which is a long story in itself. But
the Great Rebellion. Yeah.
Yeah. But part of that was, New Age, the beginning of New Age stuff like, everybody was into Buddhism and looking into, Eastern ways of thinking. And I explored that. I looked into that, and I couldn't make any sense of it, frankly. I just didn't get it. But I was interested in that, and I looked into several religions. I read a few things about Jewish mysticism, a couple of books. As I said, Buddhist mysticism. Mysticism was what I was looking at, because to me that was not in science, so that might explain things. I didn't really see anything terribly interesting. I kind of just put it aside after a while and forgot about it. But it was in the back of my mind. And somewhere around that time, I had that first dream. And that first dream was incomprehensible to me. And it didn't really move me much. But later, when I thought back on it, I realized what it meant. And it was powerful.
Do you mind sharing a little bit? Is it okay?
I could tell it very quickly. Anyone who's seen this on other videos, I apologize because I repeated it a few times. But it was very simple. I was holding on to the edge of a cliff for dear life, and I'm terrified of heights, so this was a real nightmare. And I was screaming, "Help! Help! Somebody help me!" And I heard a voice. From somebody standing on the cliff who I couldn't see. The voice said, "Just let go." And what? I mean, I'll fall down. And again, the voice repeated, "Just let go." And at some point, I felt myself slipping, and I said, okay, well, I'm going to die anyway, so I let go. And when I let go, the instant I let go, the entire world turned 90 degrees. And instead of being vertical, hanging from a cliff, I was lying on the ground, holding onto a boulder. And there was a man standing there who I knew had been the man who had said, "Just let go." I woke up in complete confusion. I had no idea what that meant. Let go? What does that mean? Let go of something that I'm holding on to? Like what? I I couldn't figure it out. Um, Later, of course, it was clear what that was. Let go of everything that I believed was the essence of the universe and be open to other possibilities. The world can turn 90 degrees when you least expect it and save your life. And that's what Christ did for me. And that
Hallelujah.
was Christ who had told me to let go.
That's wonderful, Sy. In that time of those dreams coming to you, and you talked about your experience in church, peace being with you. How much does that holding on and kind of fight, those 3 years you described of just fighting against this thing? What was that like? What was the kind of inner wrestle?
That's a good question. I was not very much. It wasn't a very intense struggle. It was just something off on the side. My life was complicated in many ways. I had a marriage that was not going well, eventually ended at around the same time. I was having trouble with my career. I was doing okay, but it's difficult. And I was struggling for everything. And I was working very, very hard. This is in my 40s. And then in my 50s, things got even more complicated. I moved to Europe for 10 years, started a new marriage. Again, life was complex. And I didn't have a lot of free time to really ponder this. I know there are people who, many people who, in fact, there's one man I'm in contact right now who is really struggling with the question of faith, and it's serious with him. I mean, he gets worried that things are not going well, and I didn't have that. It was almost a side issue for me. I had too many other problems to deal with, and I just wasn't. I didn't really care that much, and that's interesting because, as I said, when I did come to faith in that moment, when I had that experience in the car, the flooding of relief that I felt was a surprise because I didn't know I was nervous. I didn't know I was that upset until when I said I believe, it all fell away. And I didn't even know it was there. And I've heard other people who have come to faith, not exactly the same story, but say similar things, that they didn't even realize how much they had been fighting sin, or they had been struggling with forgiveness, or they had been dealing with very difficult issues. They didn't realize how hard this had been until they actually saw Jesus and came to faith. And then it all went away. And they hadn't even realized it was there. And I mean, there was one other thing that happened with the same friend who had brought me to church, who was a Christian. I had some very bad experiences as a child with other kids who were in a gang in my block, and I was full of rage about that, even into my adulthood. And what she said to me was, "Well, you have to forgive them." And I said, "Never. I'm never forgive. It was terrible." And she said, "You have to forgive them." And I just sat there in silence for a while, and then I said, "Okay, I'll forgive them." And I started crying again. I don't cry a lot, but I do sometimes. And that was sort of a prerequisite, I think, for me. And I've written about this. I think I actually published an article in Premiere on this. Um, this whole idea of forgiveness and being forgiven, because of course it's a two-way street. We forgive those, we forgive their trespasses, and Jesus forgives us ours.
Mhm.
And that is so powerful, and I guess my advice to anyone who is where I was, struggling on the path, not sure what to do, is maybe first thing you should do is forgive.
Mm.
Think about who you might forgive for what they've done to you, and forgive them and accept forgiveness from Christ.
Mm.
It's
Amen.
it's a it's a I hate to use that word, but it's a mind blowing thing to do, and it sets you on the path. That's just a little additional comment I made.
Oh, it's wonderful, sir. I think it's to come back to the science. It's like, without God, you're trying to hold the universe together in your own power and your own ideas.
Right,
And then when like you said, I believe, and this peace came to you, this joy, you're letting go of trying to hold the world and the universe
right.
together. You realize that he does, and you can trust him with it instead of holding on to all of those things of the past. Oh, it's wonderful. It's
Perfect. I
always.
think you put it I really like the way you put it. It's perfect, right?
Thank you, sir. Um, just on obviously in Britain, or maybe even increasingly in America, there's a hostility in talking about faith, and maybe in it's brushed aside. Like you said, evolution explains everything, even though most people know it doesn't, or they don't want to delve into that. What would be your advice for the Christian man to kind of to know maybe aspects of science, or so that they can meet this kind of materialist um, defense that's up straight away as soon as maybe faith or God or Jesus is mentioned, and they meet this? What aspects of science do you think would help them in those battles?
Well, you see, I think my own view is that all of science declares the glory of God.
Mm.
In fact, the subtitle of my second book comes from something that I had written earlier, and then the publisher put it on in the subtitle. It's Science and Faith in Harmony, and the subtitle is Contemplations on a Distilled Doxology. And what I mean by distilled doxology is that's to me the definition of science. Because what it is it's worship of the Creator in the purest form. Praise of the Creator in its purest form, doxology. And why I say that is because the way I look at science, there's not only is there nothing in conflict with Christian faith, the existence of God, the reality of Jesus, but I think it buttresses that faith.
Mm.
And there's so much you can go to. You can look at some obvious things like the fine tuning of the physical constants, which allows there to be planets and life. You can look at the creation of life, the origin of life, which, as a scientist, I can confidently say, and I recently published a scientific technical paper in the mainstream literature that shows that what you need to have the origin of life is something that's not explainable by any science we currently know,
Mm.
neither chemistry nor physics, and that we probably need to expand what we call science. And by the way, this has happened many times in the past. If we went back in time now, let's say to 1875, and told scientists then, let me tell you where we are today. Let me tell you where you'll be in the future, okay, in 2025. The following is true. The speed of light is a constant no matter which way you go. Coming to it or going away from it, it's still the same speed. Not only that, but all the components of light are both particles and waves at the same time. And not only that, and then I would mention the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and I would mention things like uh, quantum, quantum tunneling, other things in quantum physics that are just way outside of anything that anyone in the 19th century thought was, true science. That was a period of extreme materialism. And they would look at me and say, well, that's superstitious garbage. That's not real. That's nonsense. That it's impossible. It's illogical. And then if I started telling them about what we know about cells, they wouldn't even be able to follow it. They wouldn't be able to follow the first part of it. If I told them that there is a genetic code which has all the information that cells need in order to produce replicates of themselves, to make new proteins, to make everything else, they would say, informational code? You don't get that in chemistry. That's not possible.
Wow.
And all of that is true, right? I haven't said anything that's not true. It's all scientifically true. And in fact, there is so much about our world, scientific truth about our world, that just points to creator. It points to a mind. It points to God. And in every discipline, in geology, in physics, in biology, on and on. So to choose one, I choose biology because that's what I am. And I would choose the genetic code, and I would choose, consciousness, human consciousness, which, nobody has a clue what that is. We can't even define it. You don't know what it is. But it's real, right? We know we're conscious, and we don't know what it means. And we don't know where it came from. There's so much evidence from neurology, neurophysiology, that consciousness is spread throughout the brain. The mind is not the same as the brain. This has been shown in many, many experiments. So everything about science points to God. And this book that I mentioned, the second book of mine, it consists of 44 chapters. Each chapter is a different example of how science and faith, they're short chapters, like 3 pages, but each one is another example from physics, biology, chemistry, all kinds of things, showing where Christian faith and scientific information are complementary, in harmony, not in dissonance. So,
It's wonderful. It's wonderful, Sy. In terms of, this would probably be the last question. In terms of you being a man of faith and a scientist, how does your faith enhance your kind of wonder when we look at science? Because science, if it's not all blocked in, as you say, it's an adventure, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
So what was that like for you? What does that look like for you?
Well, for me, what my faith did, I came to faith roughly around the time when I was sort of done with research. So, and then eventually I retired. And that's when I started writing my book, the first book. And what the faith did was it encouraged me, I would say led me to explore the science of things that were intriguing in my field, such as the origin of life, the limits of evolution, where does evolution work, which is, mostly it works. Where does it not work? It doesn't explain. I don't believe that evolution explains either the origin of life or the nature of humanity. Not entirely. Certainly evolution can be credited for producing, our bodies, but not our minds. There's no evolutionary evidence, and there's quite a bit against the idea that we are entirely a product of evolution, including our minds, our consciousness, including the fact that we worship God. And, this is not, this is not an aberration in humanity. It's the norm.
Mm.
And where did that come from evolutionarily? People have answers. Richard Dawkins has a whole set of answers for all of these questions. But Richard Dawkins, I should say, will also fully agree that the Darwinian evolutionary theory cannot get anywhere near explaining the origin of life. That's a biological fact that all biologists understand. The only people who try to make up stories that we can explain the origin of life are not scientists.
That's great. Last one, definitely the last one. What advice would you give to a man for God in these times in the West?
You mean to a man who wants to come to God, or is
Man who wants to be faithful, a Christian man.
wants to be faithful, right?
Mm.
Okay. Well, the first advice is, if you want it, it's yours. I mean, Christ doesn't give you an exam. The only exam is, do you repent? Do you have faith?
Mm.
You don't have to do anything else. I mean, you're a pastor. I shouldn't be telling you this, but that's my
chaplain, not a pastor. Chaplain.
A chaplain. Sorry, I'm not. My theology is still weak, but if you repent and you say and you forgive and you put your trust and faith in Jesus, that's it. You're there. It's a gift. One of the things I have in my first book is an analogy with gifts. And I say that just before I had the experience in the car, I was really seriously thinking about Christianity. I loved the story that I had read in the New Testament. I really wanted it to be true, but I felt that it was somebody handing me a gift, and I was suspicious of the gift because it was too good to be true. And I didn't want to unwrap it. So I just left it there on the floor of my cell, which had already been destroyed, but I was still not willing to leave. Maybe the gift was a key and I didn't want to, unlock the door. And finally, after the experience in the car, I realized all I had to do was accept it. It was a gift, and all I had to do was unwrap it, and there it was. And if you're at the point where you're thinking, yeah, there's some good stuff here, but it can't be real. I mean, eternal life in heaven with the Lord, salvation. That's not for me. I can't. I'll never get there. It's too good. I mean, just no. Don't say that. Say, thank you, Lord. I accept this gift. That's all. It's easy. No rituals, you don't have to walk around 3 times, whatever. You don't have to do anything except say, yes, thank you.
Amen. Dr. Sy Garte, this has been a wonderful time with you, sir. Thank you so much. Where can people reach you if they want to follow more of your work?
So my website is very easy. It's sygarte.com. I'm fortunate to have I would say, unique name. I don't know of any others in the world. It's SYGARTE, and the .com, and that website has links to contact me, and I answer people when they contact me. And with questions, whatever. It has links to my books. By the way, besides those 2 books that I mentioned, I also have a chapter in another book edited by 2 British folks, Dennis Alexander and Alistair McGrath, who are both good friends. And it's called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. And it's the testimony of 12 former atheists who came to faith partially or entirely as a result of the new atheist attempt to browbeat everybody into not being Christian, and it had the opposite effect on a number of folks, including myself to some extent. So I have the first chapter in that book, and there are chapters from some great people, both in Britain, in the U.S., a couple from South Africa, all over the world, and that book is I think catching on quite nicely, and links to all of that are there, and also a link to join my newsletter list if you want to get monthly updates, which don't come out more often than monthly, so it won't be. I don't believe in filling people's mailboxes.
Dr. Sy Garte, peace be with you, sir. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.